No, Lisa joined.
Excellent. So let everybody connect to the audio here. Good afternoon, everyone. Or if you happen to be in France, good evening. But if you are here in the States with us, I want to say good afternoon. My name is Ginny and I am with Anderson's Bookshops. We're very pleased to be presenting you this lunchtime virtual author event with Giles Milton, whose new book is Checkmate in Berlin. And joining us as moderator is Tom Mangan. I would just like to take a moment to thank you all for taking the time to watch another thing on a screen with us. Here in Chicago, anyway, it's kind of a rainy, gloomy day. So you're not missing any good weather outside, that's for sure. But as an independent bookstore who has a long history within our community, we really, really appreciate your support here. Our store has actually been run and owned by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations. So it's very personal to us. And though COVID has taken a toll on everyone, your support really helps us see the light at the end of this tunnel. So we just like to take a moment to say thank you for that. And one request, if you would hop on over in your spare time to our website, andersonsbookshop.com, or any of our social media platforms, we'd love to see you at another one of our virtual events coming up. We have lots going on between, especially starting at the end of next month. So go ahead and go over there and see what we got coming up. You have lots of things there that you will not want to miss. Also, just in a quick accessibility note, I have turned on the live transcript feature. So if you would like subtitles or a full transcript as provided by Zoom, you can choose that using the live transcript or CC button, which is at the bottom of your own screen. But to go right into our content today, we're so happy to be celebrating the release of Checkmate in Berlin, the Cold War showdown that shaped the modern world, by a storyteller, as this quote on your screen says right now, Giles Milton. He's the international best-selling author of a dozen works of narrative history, including Soldier, Sailor, Frogman, Spy, Airman, Gangster, Kill or Die, How the Allies Won on D-Day. His previous work, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is an excellent title, by the way, is currently being developed into a major TV series by our friend Tom Mangan down here. And his works have also been published in 25 languages and also include Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which was serialized by the BBC. He lives in London and Burgundy, France. So welcome, Giles.
Thank you very much.
Yes, joining us today, Tom Mangan is a film producer and screenwriter with many films to his credit, including Long Strange Trip, Tumbleweeds, 1-900 Tonight, and The Jack Bull. He has a BFA from the University of New Mexico and received a master's degree in fine arts from New York University's Graduate Film School, and is currently an associate arts professor in film production at New York University's Graduate Film Program at Tisch. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining us as well. Yeah, we're going to have you unmute there, Tom, so we can get you back on. There you are.
Very much, Jenny.
Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you guys. I know you've got a presentation, Giles. And as we go along, folks, if you've got any questions for our author, please go ahead and drop those into the chat and we'll get to those a little later on. Take it away, guys.
Hi, Giles.
Hi there. How are you doing?
Nice to see you. So tell us about this book and where did you get the idea, and who are the main? How did this all start? This the idea of the story and the story.
So every year there are hundreds and hundreds of books published about the Second World War, but there's almost nothing is published or written about the immediate post-war period. So like from 45 through to 49. And this is a period where the entire modern world is shaped, the world we live in today was shaped in those 4 years. And everything really focused in on Berlin. Berlin was where everything was decided, and the first battleground of the Cold War really began. And so I wanted to tell this story, this big sort of geopolitical story, through the main players who were in the city of Berlin in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Third Reich.
So tell us about how this all got decided. Before the war was over, it was decided how Germany and Berlin would be split up, and why were the Allies so confident about that?
Let me give you a picture here. So here's the first picture that I wanted to show. This is a famous picture. I'm sure many people will recognize it. This is the Yalta Conference. It's February 1945, and these are the big three. There's Stalin, there's Roosevelt, and there's Churchill. Look at Roosevelt, he's dying, he'll be dead in a few months. He looks terribly sick in that picture, I think. These, the big three, have gathered in Yalta really to thrash out the new world order. who gets what in the aftermath of the Second World War. And in particular, Tom, they want to decide what's going to happen to Germany and what's going to happen to Berlin. And they decide that, well, I'm going to move on a picture here, because I think this is all about maps, really, at the beginning. They decide that Germany is going to be divided into initially 3 parts. So the east of Germany is going to be occupied by the Soviets, and the west of Germany is going to be occupied by the Americans and by the Brits. The French will come in a bit later. And then they decide the same thing is going to happen to Berlin. Berlin, the eastern part of the city, is going to go to the Americans. The west is going to go to the Brits and the Americans. But look at this map. Look where Berlin is. It sits firmly and squarely in the Soviet-occupied sector of Germany, which means the troops, the Americans and British troops inside Berlin, are effectively trapped on a little island, surrounded by a sea of red, surrounded by the Red Army. As long as they maintain their wartime alliance, of course, the Americans and British have been fighting on the same side as the Soviet Union. As long as they maintain that alliance, all well and good. But what happens if that alliance falls apart? You've got the Brits and Americans trapped inside Berlin, deep inside the Soviet-occupied sector of Germany.
Well, I'm not the best political negotiator, but who negotiated this? It seems like they got outplayed by Mr. Stalin.
I think that's really true. I think at Yalta, as I said, President Roosevelt was very sick and was dying. And Churchill was just not on form, perhaps because, as one of his aides put it, he was drinking bucketfuls of Caucasian champagne. And a lot of the conference, he was, frankly, he just drunk too much, you know. So he negotiated a settlement. And look at this picture here, Tom, on the next one here. Everything that has got to come into the American and British sectors of Berlin has got to come across this motorway here, this autobahn, which leads from the western sectors of Germany into Berlin. The Allies, the Western Allies, have the use of one road and one rail line, and everything required for those garrison troops and for the population of West Berlin has to travel along this line here. And you can see already, it's not that hard to cut that line and to create a state of siege inside Berlin, inside the western sectors of Berlin.
And so when you went from one section to the other, there would be borders that you would have to go through, or how would, you know, what was the defining side of where you were on this?
Yeah, at the very beginning, when the Western Allies moved into the city, it was pretty easy to move between the different sectors. And they really tried to keep working as allies as they fought together during the war. But it quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to work. And one of the problems was that the Red Army had arrived in Berlin 2 whole months before the Western Allies, before the Brits and the Americans moved in. So the Soviets had 2 months to take control of the city and really do what they wanted to the city, you know, before the Brits and Americans arrived. And maybe actually on that note, can I move forward?
Sure.
Do you know this picture? Do you know the big picture, and maybe you know the smaller picture, the inset picture, which is,
in America, we certainly know the smaller picture. That's when we defeated the British in the Revolutionary War. Yeah. That's the famous Iwo Jima photograph, and there is a statue in Virginia.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the photographer who took the picture, the very famous also picture of the red flag flying over the Reichstag, was modeled directly on Joe Rosenthal's picture in Iwo Jima. The Soviets wanted to create an image, a propaganda image, that showed that they and they alone had captured Berlin. This was the great prize at the end of the Second World War, to capture Berlin. The Western Allies, the Americans and Brits, were still hundreds of miles away from Berlin when the Soviet army moved into the city. And this image here was flashed around the world. It was a fantastic propaganda image that Stalin knew said, hey, guys, we captured the city without your help.
Now, also, in the book, you mentioned that there's snipers still shooting. I mean, the war is still going on at this time when they put this flag up. It wasn't, they hadn't finished taking over the city, so to speak.
Yeah, this is a city in total ruins. You know, it's been bombed from the air for years by the British and by the Americans. It's in ruins, and then the Red Army have moved in, and there's been a massive battle in the heart of the city. The city's in ruins. There's no water supply. There's no gas supply. There's no electricity supply. Nothing is functioning. There's no functioning government at all. And let me move on a picture here, because these two pictures are really interesting, although they're not very good quality. The picture on the left shows the Soviets looting the city. For 2 months before the British and Americans moved in, they looted the city. Now, Berlin, some of the people watching this will have been to Berlin. Berlin houses some of the greatest museums in the Western world. They had some of the greatest treasures of Western civilization in those museums. Well, they were all carted up and taken off to Moscow. Thousands and thousands of crates of them were just taken away. And, this was loot. This was the spoils of war.
And also, I'm assuming that they're not asking this woman out on a date.
No, you're right. And this is one of the most sinister aspects of the Red Army's occupation of the city in those 2 months. The soldiers that came in were totally undisciplined. They were violent, they were drunk, and they just abused and raped countless, tens of thousands of women were raped in this period. We know for a fact that 90,000 women sought medical treatment because of rape. But we also know that there were many, many more cases. It was a horrendous time to be a Berlin woman living in the city. And of course, there were very few men in the city. They'd all been conscripted into the Nazi army, and most of them were dead.
Wow. So the Americans and the British, they were prepared to come into the city, but they were told not to come into the city?
Yeah, they wanted to come in. They were desperate to come in and claim their half of the prize, their share of the city. But the Soviets kept blocking them for week after week after week. They couldn't get in. And it wasn't until July, and here we have another picture here. We have, so it wasn't until July that the Americans, represented on the right of the picture by Colonel Howley and on the left by Brigadier Hind, and they came into the city. And so these two men are to be commandants of the various sectors. And the one on the right, when you've read my book, you know he's such a great character. This is Colonel Frank Howling Mad Howley. He's going to be the commandant of the American sector of the city. And he's a great cowboy character who is determined to run it entirely on his own rules, no red tape, nothing. He's just going to run it as he sees fit, and he gets things done. He's a real doer, a logistics expert. He's just going to run it as his own personal fiefdom, really, his sector of the city. Great character. And on the left of the picture here, we have the British commandant, Brigadier, you would get this, only the British would name somebody, he's called Brigadier Robert Looney Hind, totally eccentric. He's come out of British India, and he's going to run the British sector of the city, a bit like it's the Raj, it's British India, it's the empire. He'll run it very fair-mindedly, like a sort of cricket umpire. So these two men are going to be absolutely critical in everything that's going to happen.
Now, Howley, he had no real war experience, right? He was more of a, not administrator, but more of a logistical officer. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He was a logistics guy down to the tips of his fingers. He was a brilliant logistics guy. He'd come into France on the tail of the D-Day landings. He'd been put in charge of the port of Cherbourg. Then he'd been put in charge of liberated Paris, which had no food. So he had to find food for 5 million starving people, which he did with some panache. So he really was the ideal guy to go into Berlin and basically run a sector of the city which was in total ruins. As I say, nothing was functioning. So yeah, and likewise, Brigadier Hind on the left of the picture, he also
was involved in army logistics. So these guys knew how to get things done. They were pretty good choices on the part of the Americans and the British who sent them in.
So who got there first, the Americans or the Brits?
The Americans got there just a few days before the Brits, and the picture on the screen now is in the background. You can see the famous Brandenburg Gate, and here you have the American tanks and armored cars moving into the city. So both the Americans and the British, in their sectors, they're going to have a garrison of about 25,000 troops each, and these are to look after their sectors of the city. Yeah, they're coming in here, and they came in headed by Colonel Howley, who was running things from the front.
So how common is it when a country is taken over by another group of countries to split up territories like this? I mean, is this, I know about this from history books, but I don't know really about any other cities that were divided by the victors.
No, I mean, there was the only other place where it was happening was Vienna, but really, I think we can look at Berlin as an almighty experiment to see if it could work. Well, let me move on to this picture here.
Yeah, how did it work?
Yeah, so you have the commandants of each sector running their own sector, but Berlin's a major city with millions of inhabitants, and you need some sort of common place where they can meet with their Soviet counterpart and thrash out sort of problems that affect the city as a whole. And they do that in this building here called the Kommandatura, it's going to be called. And this is where Colonel Howley and Brigadier Hind are going to sit down with their Soviet opposite number, Colonel Alexander Kotikov, and try and thrash out the big problems of the city. And these are things like rationing for the people as a citywide. It's things like denazification, tracking down Nazis who are still lurking in the city and making sure they don't get away. So they're going to sit in this building. And I have to say, Tom, when I went to Berlin to research this book, this building is still there. I went up to that front door, pushed it open, and walked inside the building, and someone said, oh, what are you doing in here? And I explained I was writing this book, and they said, come up to the first floor. They took me up the staircase, took me up to the first floor, and the room in which the four commandants met is exactly the same as it was in 1945. That's everything fantastic. Is the same. The tables there, the chairs are there, and this is where they wrangled over everything, but bickered over everything about Berlin.
So the four of them are, and the French is one of the fourth, right?
Yeah, that's right. They come in a bit later, and they play much less of a role. Really, the key players all the way through this story from 45 to 49 are the Americans, the British, and the Soviets.
And this commandant for the Soviets, Howley took an immediate dislike to him, or what was the idea? Was there supposed to be, were allies, were friends? Like, would they start off on the right foot, or they start off on the wrong foot? And can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really important point, actually. And hang on, let's get him up. So this is the Soviet commandant, General Alexander Kotikov. Now, Colonel Howley, and this is where the story really gets interesting, and this is where the geopolitical story, the big picture, gets focused down onto these commandants sitting in that room. Because Howley, almost within days of arriving in Berlin, he realizes that the Germans are no longer the enemy, actually. The enemy is the Soviets, and they are perfectly represented by General Alexander Kotikov. And they, from day one, they're going to have massive fights in the Kommandatura over everything. They don't agree on anything at all. There's a great example, is that they all agree that there has to be rationing in the city because there's almost no food, but they don't agree on who should get the most rations. So Colonel Howley, very reasonably, says it should be the old, the sick, and the infirm who get the biggest share of the rations. Colonel Howley says, no, it should be the most important people, which are the political people, the journalists, and likewise. And Colonel Howley turns to him and says, but you can't kick a lady when she's down. And General Kochikov says, "My dear Colonel Howley, that's exactly when you should kick them." So from day one, they are going to scrap over absolutely everything that happens in the city. It's going to become an almighty battle, but it's a perfect sort of microcosm for the bigger picture, the bigger battle between, you know, the major players, the presidents, the prime ministers, and Stalin himself.
Well, he looks right out of central casting. How did they, they were supposed to be equals, and there were treaties that were set up for that, but if he's a general and he's a colonel, is it I outrank you, or we are the Russians and we were here first and we decide, or how did they come to make a decision? Was it all unanimous, or was veto power by anybody, or how did that work?
Well, that's really interesting because Colonel Howley was furious. He actually says in his diaries, by the way, are wonderful. I came over to the States to the Army Archive in Pennsylvania, where they have all his diaries. And in one of them, he says, you know, he was absolutely furious. He said, "There I am representing the most powerful country in the world, and I'm only a colonel, and he's a general." So he didn't like that at all. But once they were inside the Kommandatura, they were effectively equals. And you're right to mention the veto. They each wielded a veto, and that was a nightmare because it meant that each one of them could block anything that the others wanted to do, and they were prepared to wield it. And certainly General Kochikov was intended and did wield his veto quite often. He's been sent in there, remember, by Stalin. His function is to try and kick the Americans and British out of Berlin. Stalin wants to have the city to himself as the first step to kicking the Americans and Brits out of the whole of Germany as well. So this is a really, really important battle that's taking place here, because if Stalin wins Berlin, he's probably going to win Germany, and then he's going to control much of Western Europe. So this is, everything is you know, at stake in this sort of showdown.
But how aware were everyone about that at this particular time? And war's over, everyone's tired of fighting, and they're just trying to feed this population of conquered people. How sophisticated were they understanding the political machinations that were going on?
It's extremely sophisticated, and it's represented. I'm going to move on a picture because hang on a minute, let me see. Okay, this picture here. So this chap on the left of the picture is called Walter Ulbricht. Now, when I was growing up, I don't know if you remember, you turn on your TV and watch the news. Certainly in Britain, you'd see these East European leaders, and they will all look like this guy here, like grim. They never smiled. They look like cardboard cutouts, basically. But they were ruthless, these guys. And this guy, Walter Ulbricht, who was a communist, he'd left Berlin when Hitler came to power, and he'd gone to Moscow, and he'd become very, very close to Stalin. And they'd hatched a plot that he was going to go into Berlin in 1945 on the tails of the Soviet army, of the Red Army, and start setting up secretly a kind of communist infrastructure inside Berlin. So by the time the Western Allies, the British and Americans arrive, there is already, the communists are in control of things like the mayoral offices, things all importantly, the police force, what remains of the police force is going to be in the hands of the communists. And in the other picture, you see the kind of old guy on the left there. This is a Wilhelm Pieck. He's head of the German Communist Party. He also has been living in Moscow during the war. And he also, excuse me, is a very good friend of Stalin's. So these two men go into Berlin before the Americans and British arrive there and take control of the infrastructure, what remains of things. And one example, which is quite extraordinary, they take control of the Berlin police force. All important, you know, law and order, always get your hands on the law and order. And who do they appoint? They appoint an ex-panzer commander, Nazi panzer commander, who's been captured at Stalingrad. He's been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, realized the Nazis have lost the war, and just changes his political colors, becomes a communist, and then goes back into Berlin to run the police force. Quite kind of extraordinary, but it shows that this was a slick and sophisticated operation.
Yeah, but they were communists in Berlin before the war, so they had to leave just for political expediency. And they were accepted into Russia. I mean, that's kind of a fascinating idea, but it was the idea they'd already started planning it when they came there. Once we take over the city, you're going back in and going to control it.
Yeah, this had been planned really over the course of 6 years of war. These were not the only two living in Moscow. There was a whole group, a large group of sophisticated and intelligent German communists who obviously had to flee Germany when Hitler came to power. It was just too dangerous for them to remain in Germany. They're naturally, they gravitated to Moscow. Stalin had welcomed them because Stalin was already eyeing up the prospects of the post-war period, and these guys were to prove very useful to him. So with the backing of the Red Army and men like General Alexander Kotikov, they are going to move into Berlin, and as I say, before the Brits and Americans arrive, they're going to try and control as much as they possibly can. And the chap on the left here, Walter Ulbricht, one of the key things he says in his diary, he wrote, we've got to make it look democratic, but we've got to have everything under our control. So that gives you some idea of, by the time Howley and Hind, the Americans and British move in, these guys, they know what they're doing. They've got things under control.
So I'm living in Berlin. Is it better to be in East Berlin or West Berlin? It sounds like the East Berlin they got it together already. In terms of if they're so sophisticated in planning this, I'm sure I'm eating well. I have electricity. I have heat. I have.
I have to say, Tom, in your dreams. Hold on a minute. Look at the picture on the right of the picture here. This is like a typical Berlin family. They are starving. There is no food in the city. There's no fuel in the city. Life is really, really rough. And here's the problem for the Americans and Brits is that Berlin's food supply has traditionally always come from the east of the city. So areas like Pomerania. These are all in the hands of, this is where the farmland is, this land is all in the hands of the Red Army. It's all controlled by Stalin's forces. So this means from day one, the Western Allies are totally dependent on the Soviets to get food supplies into their sectors of the city. And this, as I said at the beginning, as long as they remain on good terms with Stalin, that's all well and good. But if things start to go wrong, they've got a real problem on their hand because Stalin can basically starve them out of the Western sectors. And this is, a real worry, concern.
But what about the Allied forces? Do they have their own food supply, or are they reliant on this?
Well, they are bringing in their own supplies, but those supplies are coming in on the one autobahn, the one motorway route, and the one rail link that they have with the Western occupied sectors of Germany. Remember, Berlin is an island surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. So they are dependent, totally dependent, on that autobahn link and that rail link. And that's the worry. That could be cut by the Soviets and they're in big trouble. And talking of the Allied forces, look at these guys on the left of the picture. Compare it with the picture on the right. They are having the time of their lives. They come into Berlin. They are kings of all they survey. They've got unlimited supplies of cigarettes, which become the currency of choice, really. They control the black market. They've got a ton of money at their disposal, and they can have any woman they want because the women are desperate for food and are prepared to sleep with these British and American soldiers to get extra food supplies. So there are two very different stories unfolding in these two pictures. Misery for the life of ordinary Berliners and a fabulous life for the soldiers coming in. And I have to say, for many of the women actually were very happy to sort of fall into the arms of a victorious Allied soldier.
Well, can you just talk about the cigarette economy? Those are fascinating facts that each soldier got a pack of cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
And
then, because the currency's completely collapsed. I mean, it's valueless. So the currency of choice really becomes the cigarette. The cigarette becomes extremely valuable, and everything is traded in cigarettes. The entire city is functioning on the black market, and everything is traded in cigarettes. People very rarely smoke the cigarettes. It literally becomes a currency. Now, the thing is, both the American forces and the British forces, they have access to almost unlimited supplies of cigarettes. So immediately they become incredibly wealthy, and they can buy anything. They're buying not only are they buying sex, but they're buying antiques. They're buying looted materials. Anything, alcohol can be bought on the black market using cigarettes. So, and then also they can then transfer that back into dollars or pounds in the case of the British ones, and then send that back home. So unbelievably, they're sending huge amounts of cash back to their families, which they've made through the black market and through the cigarette currency in Berlin. It's an extraordinary setup, really.
So, as much as there's tension, is it working on the eastern side and the western side? Are people being fed, or where is the problem starting to arise, if there is? And I remember at one point I read in the book, I forget what the operation was called, where Churchill was going to bring war against the Russians and use ex-Nazi soldiers to join forces with the Allied soldiers.
Yeah, this is one of the most extraordinary things I found while I was researching the book. It was called Operation Unthinkable. And Churchill, who for the whole of his life had detested Soviet Russia and communism and everything it stood for. And at the end of the war, I mean, remarkably, really, he thought this was a great time to have a crack at knocking out the Red Army once and for all and knocking out Stalin. So he had his chiefs of staff put together a plan to have a massive invasion of the Soviet Union using British and American forces and Canadians. But also, as you said, because the Red Army was vast at the end of the Second World War, and the British and American army was completely outnumbered by the Soviets. So Churchill needs extra forces. Where does he find them? He says, well, we'll just use we'll use the Wehrmacht, the German army. We'll just turn them around, bring them onto our side, rearm them and use them. Not only that, he wants to use the SS as well. You know, the guys that have been involved in the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe are going to be rearmed and brought on the side of the Allies. This was Churchill's plan. When his chiefs of staff looked through the details of this plan, they said, hold on a minute, this is just insane. You know, you'll never be able to carry your population behind you with this plan. You know, this would be World War III starting within about 2 weeks of the end of World War II. I mean, it was just ridiculous, really.
Well, so tell us about the term Iron Curtain. Where does that come from, and when did that actually start?
Yeah, well, talking about Churchill actually sort of quite neatly moves us on to the famous speech, the Iron Curtain speech. So Churchill here, obviously in the left of the picture. Truman, President Roosevelt is dead by now, and President Truman is the president of the States, and he invites Winston Churchill, who's no longer prime minister. He's lost the election in Britain. He comes to Fulton, Missouri, to make one of the most dramatic speeches of the post-war period. His famous Iron Curtain speech, with its very famous line in it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. This changes everything, this speech, because up until the spring of 1946, the Americans and the British have been really trying to work and preserve that wartime alliance with Stalin. Churchill says, hold on a minute, Stalin cannot be trusted. We have to end this wartime alliance. He has become the enemy. It's like a really powerful wake-up call to North America, to Canada, to Britain, to Europe, that guy over there who we fought the war with as an ally is basically trying to take control of all of Central and Eastern Europe, and even more if he can get it. So it's a really powerful speech. And the person on the right of the picture who might not be familiar to an American audience, this is the powerful new Foreign Secretary of Britain, who is one of the few people who totally buys into this argument. Ernest Bevin is a key figure dealing with all the most senior American advisors and President Truman himself. He agrees that by 1946, Stalin is now the enemy. And it should be said, Tom, because this links directly back into Berlin, is that this is what Colonel Hawley in the American sector has been saying right from day one. He's been saying to the guys in Washington, to the guys in the White House, you've got your policy completely wrong. These guys are the enemy and we should no longer be doing business with them.
Well, now there was other proof. Didn't the U.S. ambassador to Russia write a missive that kind of, because he dealt with Stalin over there, didn't he kind of figure out that this was backed up? Because
you're right. This is, I mean, I don't know how familiar a figure he is in America now. He's in America, in my own country, in Britain, he's not known at all. But so this is George Kennan, who has worked in the American embassy in Moscow. And he'd been there for years, spoke the language perfectly, and knew Stalin intimately. He'd met Stalin on many, many occasions. And in 1946, at exactly the time when Winston Churchill's making his Iron Curtain speech, George Kennan writes and sends off what becomes known as his long telegram. And this is a wake-up call to Washington and to the White House. He basically is saying very much the same thing as Churchill. Stalin can't be trusted, ditch him as an ally, and he is now the enemy. So these two things sort of happen at exactly the same time. In the spring of 1946, and they really begin to change everything. And there's one other really key thing that happens, of course, in the spring of 1946, which is that a Soviet diplomat working in the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy in Canada, defects to the West. And he defects with absolute dynamite in his pockets, because he defects with 110 documents that prove beyond a shadow of doubt that the Soviets have been spying on the American nuclear program. They've got inside the program and they've been smuggling information back to Russia. And this blows everything apart, because Truman, he really thinks that Stalin's an ally up to this point. And suddenly he has concrete proof that the Soviets have been spying on the American nuclear program. It's a bombshell. And coupled with these other two events, Churchill and George Kennan, wow, the kind of world falls apart at this point.
It's also interesting in the book that when you talk about the kind of the fight for the brain power of the nuclear program in Germany, where the Russians were trying to get some of their scientists and the Americans were trying to get von Braun and to bring over. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people know about the Americans and the British, in fact, going after the top rocket scientists and the nuclear scientists in Germany as they overrun the western parts of Germany. And Werner von Braun is probably the most famous. He was the one, of course, taken to America with Operation Paperclip, and ends up designing the rocket that will get Americans to the moon. So, and this was a guy that had been working directly for Hitler, but his Nazi past was kind of airbrushed out, and he became a good guy once he got to America. What I didn't know was that the Soviets were doing the same on a really grand scale. So when they went into Berlin, one of the first things they did was try and track down as many scientists, nuclear scientists, rocket scientists that they could. And they snatched them and they kidnapped them and they took them back to the Soviet Union, and they were forced, many of them for the next 10 years or more, were forced to work on the fledgling Soviet rocket program, and brought, absolutely vital information for the Soviets. Quite a story. The whole thing is in the book, as you say, but I didn't know anything about that when I set out on this project.
My daughter, teenage daughter, had a history class, and she asked me about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and I had to consult your book to give her the information. Can you give everyone the little cliff notes of that?
Yeah. So hang on a minute. No, I've gone too far. Here we go. So here we go. Truman on the left, George Marshall on the right. They have decided that everything is going to change. There is an Iron Curtain, and they're going to be on the right side of it. The Truman Doctrine, President Truman announces that he's having a dramatic change of heart. And he says that any country that is threatened by communism or threatened by the Soviet Union will have the full military and economic backing of the United States of America. It's a big moment. And this becomes known in history as the Truman Doctrine. And a lot of people, I think, will have heard of the Marshall Plan. They also decide that instead of dismantling Germany and splitting it up, which had been the plan in 1945, they're going to rebuild the western part of Germany. They're going to rebuild the industry. They're going to rebuild the economy of not just Germany. You know, the whole of Europe is in ruins. And Marshall is going to pump billions of American dollars into the reconstruction of Europe because it's decided that this is the only feasible way forward. The continent has to be rebuilt. And I think I have to say there is perhaps also a touch of American cynicism there, that they're thinking there's a pretty big market to be exploited once these economies are rebuilt. So they do just that. And this is happening in kind of 1947, 48. The Marshall Plan really cranks into gear and money begins to pour into Western Europe.
So everything seems to be going pretty smoothly. What makes in 48 when things really kind of heat up between the Cold War participants?
Graphically shown in these two pictures. So the picture on the right we had earlier. So Stalin does what the Americans and British feared he might do. He cuts the Autobahn and he cuts the railway route into Berlin. And here you see the border. Behind that gate in the picture, on the left-hand side of the picture, behind that gate is the frontier post. And that gate is closed. No traffic can travel between the American and British sectors of occupied Germany into Berlin. So basically, it's a bit, if you imagine a medieval castle, they pulled up the drawbridges. Nothing can get into the western sectors of Berlin. Not only can they not get supplies in for the garrison troops, the American and British garrisons in Berlin, but nor can they get any supplies in for the 2.4 million Berliners who live in the western sectors of Berlin. This is a major problem. What are they going to do? You know.
So at what point was it the general? The commandant for the Russians, or was it Stalin? Like, and what took them so long to do this? If that was their kind of end goal all along, what was made this? What was the factor that like turned it to this point where they said, okay, we've had enough of these guys. We're going to do it Soviet way.
Yeah, it was really triggered. I mean, the city had been splitting into two separate parts over the previous years. There were two police forces, there were two city assemblies, but really it was when the West introduced the new Deutschmark, a new currency backed by dollars, that Stalin decided, right, that's he said that was a declaration of war, and at that point he cut the frontiers basically. So the Western allies at that point had a real problem on their hands. What to do? How do you feed your garrison, and how do you feed all the troops? Now, I always like to think, Tom, in a time of crisis, you summon a good old-fashioned British boffin, a British eccentric, and he is represented by this chap on the right-hand side of the picture here. He's called Reginald Waite, and he's a complete. He lives for maths. He always has a slide rule in his hands. He has tables, mathematical tables, and he works out that it is just about feasible to supply that many people by air. But it's going to be an incredible logistical exercise because you're going to have planes landing, flying in continually around the clock. Every 90 seconds, a plane is going to have to land into the two airports in Berlin. They're going to fly in at 5 different levels into the city. And this is going to be a 24-hour operation running around the clock, a quite extraordinary thing. A lot of people said it's simply unfeasible. But the chap on the left here, great character, real American hero, General Tonnage Tunner, he's put in charge of the airlift. And basically, they bring in planes from across the world, from Honolulu, Hawaii, Alaska, from the British dominions around the world, from the empire. Planes, hundreds and hundreds of planes are brought in from around the world, and they are going to do the what is they don't yet know if it's going to work. They are going to feed the city. They're going to fly in all the essential supplies, bringing them into Berlin. An amazing sort of military operation.
And now this has to be approved by Truman, right? Or is it? How does that get approved? I mean, that's like, okay, we need 18,000 planes. Who do you call, and how does that all work?
Yeah. Truman, I mean, a lot of Truman's advisors are skeptical. They say this cannot be done. It's logistically impossible. But Truman likes the idea of it. They've promised that to Berliners they're going to hold out in Berlin. They're going to stay there. It's theirs by right. And Truman says, once he gives the green light to the airlift, my God, when you read the accounts of it, it is quite amazing. You've just got hundreds of planes flying into Germany. You've got to remember that the western sectors of Berlin, they need a minimum of 4,500 tons of food a day, absolute minimum to keep the population alive. But a Dakota, which is kind of the standard plane, can only carry 2.5 tons. So that just gives some idea of just how many hundreds of planes you have to have flying in round the clock to keep the people just at, just above starvation level. But Truman gives it his blessing, as do the British. And once that happens, bang, General Tunner is going to make sure it works.
And they have to bring in fuel too. They have to bring in coal. They have to bring in gasoline or oil.
Absolutely everything has to be brought in. The Soviets have cut everything, food, fuel, the work. So yeah. And, if you want water, the water needs fuel to be pumped up from the ground underneath Berlin. So even for sewage to work, for water supplies to work, they need coal. Imagine they're having to fly in coal to fuel the power stations. I mean, this is just nothing has ever been done like this in the kind of history of warfare. This is on a scale, on an unbelievable scale. And it hangs on this man's shoulders on the left of the picture to make sure it works. If it doesn't work, there are two options. The Americans and Brits pull out, or Berlin is starved to death. And it's as simple as that, And you've got to remember, you've got Colonel Howley behind it all, making sure that it works on the ground. It's just a really incredible story, actually, the story of the airlift.
And the Berlin mayor, he have kind of like, not secret information, but he had plans for the actual functioning of the city of Berlin. And what was his role in it?
Yeah, I've got a picture of him here. So here he is on the left of the picture. Ernst Reuter is one of the great sort of unsung heroes of the siege, the blockade of Berlin, and the airlift. We tend to think of it as an American and British operation, but this guy was really popular with Berliners. He was a brilliant speaker. And he was speaking in front of crowds of more than 1 million Berliners would gather regularly in front of the Reichstag. And his role was really to keep up public morale, to tell people to keep going, hang on in there, we're going to survive this. And he was speaking on a world stage, because when he spoke, it was flashed around the world. So he was really addressing the American public and the British public when he said, people of the world, you've got to save our city. You've got to keep our city alive. A great orator, and he played this vital role in the airlift.
And on the right, that's Uncle Wiggle Wiley. What was his name?
Yeah, that's the story of the candy bomber. I'm sure some people will be familiar with that. Gail Halvorson, who was hit on this brilliant idea of dropping candy to the children of Berlin. He started it off just to be nice, basically. He felt sorry for the children of Berlin. Once it was realized, this got reported in the local press, and then the national press, and then the international press, and it was realized we could turn this into a fantastic propaganda exercise. Here you've got smiling American pilots handing out candy to smiling Berlin children, and it was exploited for all it was worth. It was turned into this fantastic propaganda exercise in which the West was seen to be this incredibly generous benefactors. So yeah, a brilliant thing.
And I guess this is the last question, but the hearts and minds are being won by food. How does the blockade, and how long did it last for, break the spine of Stalin?
I'll wrap it up briefly. I can see Ginny there now, so we'll just have the last picture to wrap it up. The airlift. Hang on. Oops. Oh, I think I've lost the. Anyway, you can probably see the small picture there. This Stalin realizes the Western Allies have won. He discreetly, in the corridors of Washington, begins to negotiate an end to the blockade. But the West, things have moved on by this point. The West have got together. They've realized the Soviet Union poses an existential threat to Western Europe, and they form NATO. And here is the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, signing the NATO treaty, in which the powers of America and the Western countries get together And there is one key clause in the NATO treaty that an attack by the Soviet Union on any one country that signed this treaty is considered to be an attack on all of them. This really is the beginning of the Cold War. You know, the Soviet Union, the idea is the Soviet Union will never dare risk an attack, provoking an attack that will be see all the other countries turn against it.
Wow. And how long was the blockade for?
It lasted for almost a year.
That's incredible.
Wow, this is fascinating information. Thank you both so much for this. This feels like a book. I always say to my kids that, you know, the way that academia shifts in you know, K through 12 curriculum here is that when I was in school, we really didn't have time to learn anything post World War II. It was the Allies won, and then basically it was the end of the school year. So we never got to learn any of these things, but I feel like this is the kind of book that I wish I had, because it's so narrative and it's full of such interesting characters to say, this is how things were parsed out, which sets the stage for so much that has happened between then and now, and it still has effects today.
That's right. And I find it's strange how some characters just kind of get lost to history. So Colonel, you know, Frank Howley, who played such a major role in everything that happened in this early Cold War period, no one's heard of him today. And, you know, I hope in a way that the book will go a little way to, you know, kind of restoring him to his rightful place in history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to ask about your research on these, all your books really, but for this one, how do you get to direct first person sources? Where do you go for looking into these topics?
For me, it's absolutely essential that there's a fantastic primary source material. So I spend rather too much of my life in the archives, delving around, looking for diaries, for private letters, for all the stuff that adds flesh to the historical sort of narrative. You know, it's so important to know about the characters. And when you have someone like Frank Howley, who, as I said, he left this unbelievable, every single day he wrote a very, very detailed diary. And when I ended up in Pennsylvania and you know, in the Army archives, and they had this diary there, and you read it and you think, wow, this is just fantastic.
Wow.
And often the families themselves are really helpful. So Brigadier Hind, the British brigadier, British commandant, his two daughters who went to Berlin and stayed in Berlin during the, you know, in 1946, 1947, they had a lot of their father's papers as well. And they were really helpful. And they told me also what life was like as a, you know, as a 17-year-old girl going into a ruined city where there are still corpses lying under the wreckage, you know.
Wow. Wow. I wonder, and I've spoken to a lot of historical writers, nonfiction, but also historical fiction writers, and curious what you think about, and Tom, you as well, in creating different versions of this content. There's so much primary source now. So when, you know, in 50 years, when somebody is looking back at, you know, things that happened in 2020, you know, there's going to be so much primary content that they can access. And how do you think that's going to affect, you know, authors like yourself and trying to research more about these topics and these times? How do you weed through the, you know, the extra stuff?
Yeah, but you raise an interesting point there, because I worry actually that there might not be as much stuff, because, you know, from the 40s and 50s, you have all the written, like I say, the diaries and everything. Mm-hmm. Will emails be preserved? You know, will all the stuff with, you know, those little asides, you send an email off to somebody and, you know, often it seems like trivial information, but it can shed a lot of light on somebody's character. Will that be preserved? Will we have access to that? I don't know. I really hope so, but right. You know,
yeah, the permissions question.
Maybe Tom as well. You're in the question of making films and TV, and you know, how far can you stray from the sources, Tom?
Well, I think if a story feels real, I think audiences identify with it even in a stronger way than if it's fictional. And the more you can stay close to the actual event and what might have happened, I think is an entryway in for most people. I mean, it's hard to invent some of the things that you have in this book that are not as extraordinary as what is in the book. For example, the woman who, I was just thinking about this, the woman who was the assistant to the dentist for Hitler, and how she was used as a political pawn to for Stalin's purposes to say Hitler was still alive. She actually proved that Hitler was dead with the dental records.
Wow.
And then the Russians took her and she disappeared, right? Forever. She was never
it's a terrible story. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I'd never come across that story before, but yeah, like you say, she managed to prove without a shadow of doubt that that Hitler was dead, because they found his jawbone and they found his dental records. But I think very briefly, I think you have to be sometimes careful if you stray too far from the truth. A lot of people might have seen the film The Darkest Hour about Churchill. And there's one scene where Churchill goes down into the London Underground and meets locals, people traveling by on the subway. And for a Brit, this is just completely ridiculous. I mean, Churchill traveled everywhere by Rolls Royce. He never went down into the subway in his life. So, but apparently a lot of people love that scene in the film, said, oh, it's so amazing, his contact with, real people. But it maybe looked nice, but it was completely ridiculous.
Sure.
Also, I visited Giles in London a couple of times when he goes to work, and he goes to work at the library. And it's fascinating to see him at work. It's really mining for gold in a way that he does every day. And he's not the only one. There's other gold miners there.
Sure. But I bet he takes a Rolls Royce, right?
If only.
Yes. Oh, you're telling me that this is not the millionaire making gig, Giles?
Well, if it is, it's in the future.
There you go. Well, we can all send you those good wishes. Really quickly, I just want to ask Tom and Giles too, is the film adaptation of the Churchill story. How's that coming?
Tom first.
It's taking longer than World War II took. No, we almost have the first pilot episode, and we've been working diligently on it to get it. But it's a story that's tough to get right, because it's such a large story. It covers practically every country that was involved in the theater of war, but also the eccentric people that were involved in coming up with these new weapons to defeat Hitler. And they're not military guys or women, and they're not scientists. They were just kind of strange people that came up with things that could help to win the war. And it's, how do you, who wins a war for you? Is it the military or is it the people of the country? And I think one of the key elements of the storytelling is this: these are not soldiers that won this war. These were people who did not like to fight in war, because military people, they're pretty sophisticated. If they know they're going to lose the battle, they'll surrender. But if you're a citizen, there's no such thing as surrendering.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to fight to the end, and that's what it's making citizens into warriors is really at the heart of the story. And the head guy who kind of ran this operation, he had two sons, and they both were fighting in the war, and he wanted them to get home as quickly as possible. So he was sending out people on risky missions that there was a 50% chance they were never going to make it back, all in the hope that he could end the war early and get his children back.
Wow.
The idea really is that the dirtier you fight, the quicker the war will end. What I really like about it, and this has come out in the first pilot we've done, is that there's a really major role for women. Most war films or things dealing with the war they're male dominated, but the special operations in Britain was unique in employing a lot of women, and I think it's going to be great to see some powerful women center stage of this adaptation.
And there's a character that's actually in both books, Joan Bright. She was actually at Yalta, but she was the head secretary, and she ran all the operations with all the other secretaries, and they would bring her the information about what was going on, and she reported to Churchill. And she apparently was the model for Miss Moneypenny from the James Bond series, because Ian Fleming's brother was a member of this ministry and had told stories to his brother about this woman. And then it was a pleasant surprise when I was reading the new book, and there's Joan Bright showing up again.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really interesting. I would almost say that might be a slightly unpopular opinion here in the US anyway, that the real heroes were not the soldiers on the ground, but the citizens there who kind of had to fight back. But I think that's very valid, the balance of both of them. And of course, I'd love to see more women in their roles. They were there, taking center stage. I mean, I think about, wasn't it Agatha Christie that was a spy? That's where she learned all about poisons and things. And then that's ended up in a lot of her books.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. And there's been quite a boom of books in the historical fiction realm, certainly, and also nonfiction about women's roles in World War II. And I look forward to more of those stories. Well, unfortunately, our time is up for today. I want to thank you both so much joining us from New York. I think that's where you are, Tom, right?
I'm actually at the Jersey Shore.
Ah, lucky you. And of course, Giles in France, lucky as well. Thank you both for joining us from those locations and to talk about this really fascinating book. We really appreciate it. For those of you who purchased a copy of the book in advance of this event, Giles was kind enough to send us some signed book plates. Thank you. And we'll get those shipped out to you just as soon as we can. We are humans in the basement of a bookstore sending those out. So give us a little bit of time here. We want to get that in your hands just as soon as possible so you can immerse yourself in this great world. Anything else you guys would like to end with?
I think I've said everything I can say.
Buy the book and read the book. It's fantastic.
Oh, that's a good thing to say. Yeah. Very good.
Well, you've done my job for me. We do, even if you didn't purchase a book with your ticket here, we do have extra signed copies available. And I will send out a link to all of you in case you would like to purchase that. It also is going to make a great gift. It's not too early to start thinking about the holidays. So if you've got somebody in your life who's a real history buff, of course, this will be an excellent, or even a current events, a news head, be a great gift for that person in your life as well. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our speakers. Everybody, happy reading and be safe out there.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.